When studying history, we often see the cyclical nature of power, the rise of wicked rulers doing truly evil things. The question of whether a sovereign will become a benevolent guardian or a destructive madman when a child is hastily seated on the throne is always a profound gamble. The outcome, it seems, hinges less on innate character and more on the influences of their upbringing and environment. In the tragic narrative of Charles IX of France, the dice were heavily loaded against him from the start. Born in Saint-Germain-en-Laye in old 1550, young Charles was a prince, a title that promised a grand future. One would naturally assume that his father, Henry II, would eventually pass away in old age, after dutifully imparting years of governance and profound wisdom. Charles would then inherit this stable, enlightened legacy. But fate rarely honors such pleasant expectations. Instead, King Henry II met a shockingly ignoble end. A fragment of a splintered lance pierced his eye during a jousting match, leading to a fatal infection. A death of such dramatic and frankly embarrassing circumstance is still a death, and the mechanics of succession demanded a new king. Thus, Charles was thrust into the spotlight, acquiescing to the duty of the throne, especially after the premature death of his older brother, Francis II. His official ascent to the throne occurred in 1560. Those familiar with mathematics and chronology will instantly realize that in 1560, the new monarch was a mere 10 years old, a fact that is entirely correct. This compact, bewildered boy was now king, but possessed no real capacity to govern. Consequently, the immense responsibilities of the crown were transferred to his formidable mother, Catherine de Medici, and she had strategic designs that would shape the kingdom. This period in France was defined by an intensely bitter religious conflict, primarily between Catholics and Protestants. Despite sharing a fundamental faith in the same God, their differing interpretations of theology were distinct enough to fuel widespread, brutal violence against one another. Catholics represented the significant majority of the population, while the Protestants, chiefly a splinter group known as the Huguenots, were a persecuted, rebellious minority, constituting approximately 10% of France's populace. As the years saw violence steadily worsen, Catherine attempted to introduce a measure of stability by issuing the Edict of January. This decree essentially declared, "Look, we will afford you a limited toleration, but you must cease the agitation, maintain civil order, and adhere strictly to the rules." However, the staunch Catholic faction within the French aristocracy was deeply displeased with the concept of even tolerating what they considered heretical Protestants. A pivotal figure in this outrage was Francis, Duke of Guise. The Duke had prior, deeply negative interactions with the Huguenots, having recently thwarted an alleged plot to remove him from power. His ensuing fury culminated in the Massacre of Vassy. Here the Duke discovered a large congregation of Huguenots worshipping in a church located on his estate, and he orchestrated a violent attack that left many dead. This single, brutal event is widely considered the catalyst for the first of what would become a protracted series of French wars of religion. So, how did this ceaseless conflict affect the young King Charles? During the intermittent religious wars, Charles himself became a target. He survived multiple attempts on his life, including plots for assassination and schemes for abduction orchestrated by the Huguenots. These personal attacks made it exceptionally difficult for the young monarch to feel any measure of sympathy or empathy for the Protestant cause. Upon reaching his 13th birthday, Charles declared himself of age and fully capable of ruling, thereby claiming complete authority. However, the shadow of Mama Medici's influence remained pervasive. With thousands of his own subjects killed and the royal treasury severely depleted, Charles became convinced that he had to definitively end the wars. He conceived a desperate diplomatic maneuver. Charles arranged a marriage between his devoted Catholic sister, Margaret, and the staunch Huguenot leader, Henry of Navarre, portraying the union as an act of profound good faith and a final offering of peace. The most affluent and influential Huguenot nobles flocked to Paris to witness the royal wedding. Sadly, for many, this journey would be their last. Growing anxieties and deepening paranoia regarding the heavy influx of Huguenot leaders convinced Charles and his mother that a Protestant uprising was imminent. Therefore, on the night of August 22, 1572, heavily swayed by his mother's counsel. Charles issued the chilling order for the execution of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a towering figure among the Huguenot leadership present in the city. This targeted murder immediately triggered the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, a coordinated, systematic slaughter of thousands of Huguenots throughout Paris. Homes were invaded, shops were looted and destroyed, and the corpses of the murdered were shamefully dumped into the Seine River. Some historians posit that Charles, perhaps seeing an opportunity to eradicate the Huguenot power base entirely, may have encouraged the violence to spread beyond the city limits, even though he later called for a cessation of the killings to salvage his public image. Over the next few weeks, the death toll soared. Tens of thousands of Huguenots were executed across France. Paradoxically, the massacre achieved the opposite of its intended goal. The Protestants, predictably enraged and utterly disillusioned, launched a renewed series of religious wars that tragically would persist for another 26 years. King Charles, however, would never live to see any resolution or peace. The harrowing aftermath of the massacre completely shattered the young king's mind, leaving him to swing wildly between moments of delusional boasting and crushing, genuine remorse. One day, he would brag about the horrific extent of the bloodbath. The next, he claimed to be tormented by the screams of his victims. His mental deterioration was profound, as he was consumed by overwhelming grief over the incident. Adding to his agony, Mama Medici only worsened his condition, placing the entire blame squarely on his shoulders and publicly labeling him a raving lunatic. In this vulnerable, psychologically weakened state, the young king contracted tuberculosis in the spring of 1574. A few months later, at the premature age of 23, King Charles IX literally coughed his way out of the world. So, was Charles IX inherently evil, or was he merely a deeply flawed product of historical circumstance and poor parenting? It remains a chilling and unresolved question. But speaking of bad deals, we're not quite done with this tragic roll call. When a monarch is saddled with the damning and evocative title of the Cruel, a title that is undeniably dramatic, it signifies a lifetime earned through a sustained pattern of shocking atrocities, or simply being an utterly contemptible human being. Let's examine the actions of Peter I of Castile and how he attained this infamous moniker. Born in 1334, Peter was a seemingly impressive figure, a 6-foot-tall, blond, blue-eyed, and well-built man. He was diligent and highly educated, possessing all the outward qualities of a potentially great ruler. Yet, his model for kingship was terribly flawed. His father, Alfonso XI, was a famously ruthless king. In the brutal politics of that era, ruthlessness was often a prerequisite. Too lenient, and your enemies would surely overrun you. Too tyrannical, and you risked a dagger in the back. Alfonso was a calculated strategist who aggressively expanded his kingdom, systematically arresting and executing political opponents, frequently bypassing any form of legal trial. It is abundantly clear where the foundation for Peter's future brutal policies was laid. In 1350, King Alfonso XI tragically succumbed to the widespread Black Plague that was devastating Europe. His passing immediately vacated the throne for Peter. The resolute young prince took the crown that same year, becoming the king of the Iberian kingdoms of Castile and Leon. However, the transition was anything but peaceful. Alfonso had taken a mistress who had borne him several illegitimate sons, Peter's half-brothers, who naturally asserted their own claims to the throne. The most notable among them was Enrique, whose story we'll revisit later. King Peter was only 16 when crowned, and he initially relied on the political counsel of his mother. One piece of maternal advice was to marry the young 14-year-old Blanche of Bourbon in 1353. Clearly unenthusiastic about this state marriage, Peter, just 2 days after the ceremony, abandoned Blanche for his true mistress and deep love interest, Maria de Padilla, whom he had secretly married before the official union with Blanche. They went on to have 4 children together. The fate of Blanche is genuinely sad. Peter not only abandoned her, but had her imprisoned in a remote town near the southernmost tip of the Iberian Peninsula, far from court. Though briefly a queen, Blanche died in captivity in 1361, under highly suspicious circumstances. Some historical accounts suggest Peter had her poisoned, while others claim she was killed by a crossbow bolt to the skull under his direct command, though this remains a topic of debate, a cruel act by any measure. Interestingly, during his reign, Peter also garnered the title of Peter the Just from his own loyalists and supporters. The king sought to consolidate royal power, centralizing it away from the powerful noble class, and notably extended legal protections and platforms to common citizens and minority groups, particularly the Jews and Muslims. The nobility, entirely predictable in their response, strongly resented this erosion of their power. But given Peter's absolute authority, any nobles who showed signs of rebellion or treason were soon given a quiet, final view of the horizon from the end of a hanging rope. This pervasive turbulence and unrest among the aristocratic ranks only intensified the desire to overthrow the increasingly unstable king. This is precisely when his various half-brothers resurfaced. Following numerous rebellions instigated by these half-siblings, Peter successfully captured and executed all of them, even having their mother put to death. One account claims a brother was brutally hacked to pieces, as Peter looked on with a disturbing, triumphant smile. Crucially, however, one brother managed to escape: Enrique. Enrique evaded capture and fled to France, where he began amassing allies under the protection of French King John II. This struggle drew the attention of another regional power, Peter of the neighboring kingdom of Aragon. Thus began the War of the Two Peters in 1356. Castile initially dominated, but Aragon had its secret weapon. Yes, Enrique was back, now backed by the forces of both Aragon and the French crown. Enrique successfully infiltrated Castile and managed to depose Peter, who was forced to flee to England to secure military support for his revenge. He achieved his goal, regaining his throne after the Battle of Nájera in 1367. However, in a significant political misstep, Peter failed to adequately compensate or pay tribute to the English for their decisive aid. Back in command, Peter systematically tortured and executed any noble he merely suspected of supporting Enrique, often acting on pure suspicion and paranoia. For the next few years, Peter existed in a state of absolute paranoia, unable to trust any advisor or noble, which inevitably led to the collapse of his political administration. Seeing the perfect moment for a decisive final strike, Enrique attacked once more, leading to the Battle of Montiel in March of 1369. Peter was defeated, captured, and, in a horrifying final act of fraternal violence, was stabbed in the face with a knife by his half-brother, Enrique. Enrique finally took the throne for good, reigning until his death by heart failure a decade later. Moving to Chinese history, the story of Dixon of the Shang Dynasty stands as a quintessential case study of how unbridled greed, systemic corruption, and brutal tyranny can twist a leader into a figure of utter moral depravity. After his fall, Dixon was given the posthumous title of King Zhou, pronounced Zhao, where the character Zhou refers to the leather loop on a saddle that wraps around a horse's tail and brushes against its hindquarters. It is a remarkably creative insult, indicating that this ruler must have committed truly unforgivable offenses. Given that he was an ancient king, we must rely on historical accounts that are often heavily embellished and legendary. Therefore, we must approach this chapter with a degree of skepticism. This King Butthole Strap began his reign around 1075 BC. According to the famous ancient Chinese historian Sima Qian, King Zhou was a man of exceptional gifts. He was brilliant enough to outmaneuver any political opponent and reportedly physically strong enough to successfully hunt with his bare hands. A bold claim, but we proceed with the narrative. Paired with his favorite consort, the beautiful and notorious Daji, the couple became a legendary force of torture and endless torment for those unfortunate enough to be in their sphere of influence. While he is credited as a competent military strategist who managed to expand his empire through campaigns, the king became utterly blinded by his intense infatuation with Daji and systematically drained the kingdom's coffers on staggering extravagances. He was determined to live like the king he believed himself to be. Legend asserts that King Zhou would stop at nothing to fulfill Daji's slightest desires, even constructing an elaborate palace garden stocked with rare and exotic animals. Not so bad, one might initially think, but consider forcing his royal subjects to literally drink from a freshly excavated wine pond or consume meat hanging from nearby tree limbs. Oh, and adding to the absurdity, they were reportedly all required to be naked. These breezy brunches and countless other over-the-top, nonsensical projects were financed entirely by the taxes levied on his starving populace, a practice that predictably incited widespread public fury. The king's public support effectively plummeted to zero. The immediate problem for the populace was that any individual who dared to speak out was instantly subjected to imprisonment and gruesome torture. One such torture was the roasting beam, an invention reportedly of the king's own design. This was a long, hollow bronze beam suspended over a roaring fire, stuffed with searing hot coals, transferring extreme heat to the highly conductive bronze surface. The king allegedly would also apply grease to the long pole. According to the stories, King Zhou would force prisoners to attempt walking across this pole, promising release if they succeeded. None ever did. An alternative version of this gruesome device involved a bronze column stood upright, to which the victim was chained while a fire raged beneath them, slowly cooking the victim to a state described as delicate medium rare, firm, yet with a slight give. The king and his main consort reportedly reveled in the pain inflicted on their prisoners, watching the torment unfold as if it were pure, compelling cinema. When rulers live in such excessive luxury and act as maniacal tyrants to a suffering and destitute population, it is a simple consequence that the subjects will eventually harbor a passionate desire to kill them. King Zhou's own relatives desperately begged him to alter his wicked ways and shift toward a more noble and kind rule. He remained resolutely unpersuaded until a significant rival emerged in the person of Jifa of Zhou, pronounced Zhou. While the evil King Zhou was preoccupied watching men burn, Jifa was methodically gathering a powerful army. Refusing to acknowledge the threat, the king answered the call of war at the Battle of Muye in 1046 BC. There, he was utterly defeated, an overwhelming metaphorical sock-knocking off. The disgraced king retreated into his palace, surrounded himself with his immense personal treasures, and in a final symbolic act representing the gilded disaster of his reign, set everything, including himself, ablaze. At the age of 59, Daji, upon hearing of her beloved king's death, chose to exit the world by strangling herself. Daji was ultimately blamed for the king's extreme erratic behavior, many believing her to have been possessed by a demonic nine-tailed fox spirit, a classic trope in Chinese mythology. And with the death of King Zhou, the Zhou dynasty then claimed control, ushering in a new era. The word terrible is so casually overused, it has practically lost its original profound meaning, much like the word literally. While terrible can certainly mean something exceptionally bad, its true ancient sense refers to something that instills terror, something truly sinister, essentially pure evil. There is a vast gulf between saying, "Ugh, this is terrible," and recognizing that this is the terrible, which is why Ivan was bestowed with this very epithet, creating a tragic, yet deeply terrible historical parable. Following the pattern of young monarchs, Ivan began his reign at the age of 16 when he was crowned Tsar of all Russia in 1547. His initial years as a sovereign were remarkably peaceful and progressive. The Tsar successfully revised the Russian law code, established a professional standing army, and significantly granted rights of self-government to rural regions. However, in 1553, Ivan was struck down by a near-fatal illness. Weak and worn on what he believed was his deathbed, Ivan requested that his most trusted nobles swear allegiance to his infant son should he pass away. They refused to commit to this pledge. Ivan's health eventually recovered, but his trust in his supposedly loyal nobles did not. The Tsar then focused on expanding Russian territory, hoping to secure lucrative new trade routes. This ambition naturally provoked numerous conflicts over territorial control. Ivan achieved considerable success, but each victory came at a devastating cost to Russian resources. Then, in 1558, came the Livonian War. This war was fought to seize control of the region of Old Livonia, which would grant Russia the vital, long-sought access to the Baltic Sea. Pitted against the powerful kingdoms of Sweden and Poland, along with Lithuania and other European states, Russia was pushed to the brink. The financial toll of this war plunged the country into severe economic ruin. From this point, things rapidly worsened for Ivan, Famine and prolonged drought ravaged the land, his wife died, and a series of devastating political betrayals caused the Tsar to spiral into a profound manic depression. He was so distraught that he even drafted a letter of resignation from the throne. The nobles, terrified by the prospect of governing the collapsing country themselves, begged Ivan to return to power. He agreed, but with one ironclad condition. He demanded to be granted absolute, unrestricted power over every aspect of the country, and most critically, the undeniable right to execute any citizen he deemed a traitor to the crown. They hesitantly consented. Thus Ivan returned, gripping power with an unrelenting, tyrannical fist. He immediately created the oprichniki, his own private and loyal guard. In exchange for wealth, privilege, and land, these soldiers served as Ivan's brutal eyes and ears across Russia, tasked with ruthlessly sniffing out any sign of potential disloyalty. This immense power was left entirely unchecked. Under Ivan's direct command, the oprichniki executed and exiled thousands of nobles, systematically seized their ancestral lands, and harshly oppressed the peasant population. The situation spiraled further downward. By 1570, the infamous plague tore through Russia, killing thousands of people every single day. Novgorod, one of Russia's most critical and prominent cities, was crippled by the trifecta of plague, famine, and Ivan's cruel rule. Ivan became convinced that the entire city planned to defect to Lithuania. Remember, the devastating Livonian War was still dragging on. So, he decided to launch a preemptive strike of unimaginable brutality. In January of 1570, Ivan's oprichniki forces invaded the city, instituting a terrifying reign of systemic terror. Escape was impossible, as Ivan's troops had entirely barricaded the city's exits. Captives were subjected to extreme torture for information about a betrayal plot that simply did not exist. Citizens were either burned alive or bound and thrown into the freezing river, left to suffocate under the thick ice. Farms surrounding the city were completely annihilated, effectively condemning the already starving survivors to death by lack of sustenance. By the end of the massacre a few weeks later, thousands of people lay dead in the wake of Ivan's frenzy. All valuables from homes, shops, and churches were stripped bare, taken back to Ivan's residence in Moscow, and divided among the oprichniki soldiers. The Tsar's brutality had reached its terrible peak, but the violence was about to strike tragically close to home. On November 16, 1581, Ivan entered into a violent argument with his 27-year-old son, Ivan Ivanovich, after he had savagely beaten his pregnant daughter-in-law, Yelena, for being, in his view, inappropriately dressed. The father-son confrontation rapidly escalated to a boiling point. In a fit of rage, Ivan lashed out, striking a single fatal blow across his son's head with a heavy cane. He had murdered his own child. Worse still, Yelena miscarried her baby just hours later due to her injuries. Ivan collapsed, a broken man, cradling his son's corpse, the totality of his life's desolation and despair flashing before him. Following this traumatic event, Ivan was consumed by deep remorse for his past actions. In his final years, the Tsar finally agreed to a truce with Lithuania, bringing an end to the agonizing 24-year-long Livonian War. He attempted to resolve all outstanding issues and make peace with himself. However, his physical health continued its rapid decline. By 1584, Tsar Ivan was a frail figure. Although only 53, decades of intense physical and mental anguish had destroyed his body and mind, compounded by the long-term toxic effects of mercury addiction. On March 28, 1584, Ivan suffered a stroke and died while engaged in a game of chess, a final dramatic scene where two kings fell simultaneously. This is the dark history of the Tsars. If you found this analysis compelling and want to explore more tales of the wicked and the powerful, make sure you subscribe for future deep dives, and leave a comment below with the name of the next ruler you want us to investigate.